The night he took the eggs into the crypts, Eddard Stark felt the earth listening. Winterfell stones had heard everything before: oaths and executions, births and quiet betrayals. And though his boots made no sound upon the worn steps, he thought each descent was counted, each breath weighed. In one hand he carried the iron lamp whose light swung like a small, private moon. In the other he cradled a river-wrapped bundle as gently as he had once lifted his daughters from their cradles. The heat of the hot springs breathed up through the stones, warm as the hidden heart of a beast. Behind him the passage narrowed, swallowing the last suggestion of the world above. He did not look upon the faces of his forebears as he passed. He knew the line of them too well: granite kings with long stone swords across their knees, wolves at their feet, the plain cut of their mouths speaking judgment even in the dark. He had not told Catelyn. He had not told Maester Luwin or Benjen when his brother still laughed beneath these rafters of earth, as if all the seasons were simply games that men played with the wind. He had told no one at all. There are secrets you carry like a wound, and then there are secrets you carry like a child. These were the latter. The river-wrapped bundle weighed more than its size allowed. A cousin of his, she of the violet eyes who had once danced in a hall of falling stars, had whispered that dragon eggs were the world's heaviest promises, and he had laughed, because Eddard Stark did not believe in the fancy of southern houses or the poems they made of their crimes. But the years had taken him farther from his laughter. Rhaegar's songs had burned a kingdom to ash. Lyanna's fevered breaths had counted out a fate for his life. And when the last of that story lay dying in his arms, he had begged the gods for a path that would not lead to more graves. He knelt at the oldest of the crypts, where the stone was so ancient it had lost its memory of being cut. The lamplight lay on the weather-softened face of the first of the kings of winter, whose name the North had not bothered to keep. The spring's warmth seeped through the floor, made the air a living breath. There the vault's mortar was strange, as if the builders had mixed it with something chalky and dark. Dragonglass dust, old Nan had muttered when Eddard, half a boy still, had followed her down to say a prayer over his grandfather's bones. A foolish thought then, not foolish now. He set the lamp upon the floor and eased the bundle open. There were 3 eggs wrapped in cloth as fine as a wager and as stained as travel. One deep green, fissured with black. One as pale as snow with veins of smoky silver. One the dull, dense red of iron exposed to weather, flecked with a black that would not reflect the lamp. They were colder than he expected, and then warmer. Their weight changed as his palms shifted, as if something within them turned a fraction and listened too. He laid them in the niche he had prepared, beneath the old stone king's sword, where a hollow cut long ago waited for a story that had never arrived. Eddard Stark did not pray for dragons. He did not pray for vengeance. He prayed for the kind of days a man could grow old in, for harvest songs and the slow laughter of summer nights and the smell of snow when it came first and clean. He prayed that whatever magic slept here would remain sleeping forever. But he was a Stark, and he understood the shape of winter. He pushed the stone back into place, sealed mortar and dust and a line of whispers. When he left, he took the lamplight with him, and the dark flowed back in like a tide. Years turned. The stone listened. The boy with the wolf found the place as if he had always known it. Jon had taken the habit, when his mind was too full, of walking the crypts alone at dawn before the keep woke. Ghost padded at his heels, white as a knife of mourning in the black. The torches were low, and the springs sent up steady warmth that smelled of iron and old rain. He traced the names in the air, felt the weight of the past not as a burden but as a presence, like the way the courtyard filled with the breath of horses just before they ran. If he had been the kind of boy to speak of such things, Jon might have said that being in the crypts made his thoughts slow down and become clear, that the ache he carried, the certain knowledge of being almost and not quite, of standing between doors that never opened, grew quieter here. He did not tell anyone. He walked, and behind his ribs the tightness unwound one knot. Ghost stopped. The white wolf's head swung toward the oldest vault, ears pricked, lifting his nose to a scent Jon could not name. He had come this way dozens of times, felt the same bench of stone beneath his palm, but something had shifted, almost as if a breath could be felt through the crack in a sealed window. Ghost whuffed softly and pressed his paws to the base of the old king's plinth, nails clicking against stone with a restless insistence. "What is it?" Jon touched the wolf's shoulder. Ghost's hackles lifted, not with fear, not with the rumble that meant some stranger had passed near the kitchens or a stableboy's cat had made rivalry of the night. This was focus, a scent found and traced. The wolf looked back at him, one red eye, one as pale as weathered bone, and then leaned his weight against the cuneiform seam in the mortar. Jon crouched. The stones were cool where the air was warm. He set his torch in a cradle on the wall, then ran his fingers along the mortar line. There was a place, smooth as if long fingers had polished it a lifetime, which pressed back. His heart gave that hard, brief stroke that made all the world sharpen, and for an instant the crypts were so quiet that he could hear Ghost's breath as clearly as a thought. He pressed, and the stone gave. The first breath from the hollow smelled like the inside of a furnace long cooled, like iron and old lead. Her and the echo of heat. Ghost shoved his head into the gap, snuffling, and Jon hauled the stone aside far enough to peer within. The cavity was small, unexpected, cut like the slot in a door where a man could slide his sword when trouble came to knock. The lamplight leaned, and the faint glimmer of scales answered it. He did not reach for them right away. He looked, and his chest hurt for reasons he could not sort from each other. 3 shapes nested within the dark. An array like a knight's trophies but intimately alive. The green one first that seemed to swallow the light. The white one, faintly wet-looking though it was dry, like snow glazed by a sun that had not risen. The red one he felt before he saw. He did not know what they were, not in the way a maester might speak their lineages or a merchant their price, but Jon knew their name. He had heard all the songs that said they were gone. "Ghost," he said, as if he might ground the moment by speaking his companion's name. The wolf's breath washed warm over the stone and back in his face, rich with the smells of dog and fresh meat and snow. Jon's hand hovered, then settled, and when his fingers touched the nearest egg, the sensation was not heat but weight unfamiliar, and then something that pulsed faintly, like a memory far beneath a lake. He put his hand away. He pressed the stone back and sealed the niche again, heart loud, throat dry. At supper, he said nothing. Robb spoke of the new litter in the kennels. Sansa wondered if King Robert's court would smell like crushed oranges and sun. Arya had a new bruise and a knife he had taught her to hide well enough that even Catelyn didn't see it. Bran rode wooden horses with his eyes shut through a forest no one else could find. Jon almost spoke to Eddard Stark, almost asked a question of his father as men who are not fathers and sons ask questions. Obliquely, through weather and horses and the price of iron in White Harbor. But that was the old ache. He swallowed it, and the eggs settled behind his eyes as if they had been set there for safekeeping. That night he dreamed of snow, and of something moving beneath it like a slow, tremendous fish. When he woke, he had Ghost's teeth gently on his wrist, not breaking the skin, a reminder to be quiet. The castle breathed. Far away, a raven called. In the morning, messengers came like black cracks in the air. The king rode with half his house. Winterfell shook out its banners, and the years tipped into a new story. Eddard Stark did not come back from King's Landing. The boy who had found the eggs went away to a wall, and in every hall a different song began. Stones remember. They do not hurry. The crypts kept their quiet. Snow fell, melted, fell again. Men bled on fields they had never seen in their heads when they were boys. The summer wolf who had laughed at the sky in the training yard became a banner lord. The red woman's fire was a small bright tongue against the coals of winter. Bran fell and rose into another shape. Sansa learned the taste of a smile used like a blade. Arya crossed roads and water and faces. And in the crypts beneath, the eggs shifted when the hot springs sent up a richer ribbon of warmth, or when the old gods pressed a thought through roots that tasted of iron. They were not the eggs of a king of summer. These were eggs wrapped in winter, and perhaps the world had a different use for them. On a night when the wind rolled like a black river and the moon was a scrap of torn cloth, the dead walked into Winterfell's dreams. The raven that had once been Bran's nameless messenger landed upon the broken crenel and spoke in a voice that was not his own. The wind taught the aspens new syllables. Down in the crypts, the heat from the springs went thin and then rich again, like a candle guttering. In that pause, old stone saw old kings stir as far as stone could move, which is to say not at all, but the air around their faces cooled as if something had passed close. The first to return to the crypts was not John. It was a girl with hair grown less obedient than her needlework and a stride like a promise she had made to herself. Arya ghosted where even ghosts were expected to be solemn. She slid between the pillars, dark as a shadow's thought, and the only sound she carried was the small hush of a blade that the world was not certain she had. She had come to say names. She had come because the thought of the stone faces was steadier than the thought of any human ones. Ghost padded beside her. He had found her without surprise somewhere the kitchen's burned fat and late-night bread. She had simply said his name, and the white wolf had come as if that had been the arrangement since snow learned to fall. He was larger than her now, and silent, and his red eye picked out the edges in the dark like the fire behind a forge door. They reached the oldest vault, and he stopped, as once before, and pressed his nose to the stone as if to remind it that the living were a kind of key. Arya squatted, set her candle down, and put her brow to the stone. She did this when she made promises to herself. She breathed in incense of damp and iron and old oaths. "Show me," she whispered, so quietly that perhaps it was the gods she asked. Ghost leaned his weight. The trick of the stone was simple if you knew where to press. The world offers up even its fiercest secrets to those who treat them as equals. They made enough room, and Arya slid her hand into the dark. Her fingers found the snow-veined egg first. It was not cold. It was exactly her temperature, as if the stone had kept it and waited for her to come. She drew her hand back with a noise not unlike surprise, and then laughed soundlessly, a rush of air that made Ghost's ears flick. The egg was too big to draw out, the hollow too small. Whoever had hidden them had intended to make them difficult to love carelessly. She put her hand in again, feeling the other two by shape and by the memory. In her skin, the red one pulsed a little against her palm, or perhaps it was her heart. "Whose?" she asked the dark, and the dark did not answer, which is sometimes an answer. She left them. She pressed the stone back. She did not tell her sister. She did not tell anyone. But from that day she visited more often, and sometimes she pressed her forehead to the old king's sword and whispered a name to him as if he were a friend. The sword said nothing. It understood nevertheless. Far to the north, beyond walls of old spells and stones, John moved through snow that had long since learned his footfall. The dead had become an arithmetic now. He counted losses instead of seasons. The blade he had been given poured light into the night, and the cold tried to drink it. When he slept, he dreamed of a heat that did not scorch, a heat that felt like breath drawn into a chest after too long beneath the surface of a lake. The raven found him on an evening when even Ghost's fur could not keep the wind from his bones. It landed upon a black branch that had never known a leaf and cocked its head the way of birds. John looked at it without kindness. He had had too many messages that year. "Words," said the raven. "Below." He blinked. The raven puffed, shook its feathers, leaned toward him as if to make sure he saw the way its eye took the world in. "Below," it repeated, and then, "Home." He walked until the snow took him to a place where he could close his eyes and see Winterfell, and then he walked further until he turned south. He felt the choice clicking into place the way a sword slides into its scabbard, honest and inevitable. Ghost's gait changed, got longer, got eager. The wind shifted. Sometimes the world is very simple when it wants you to arrive. Winterfell's scars looked like a life a man might learn to live with. New stone met old. Smoke had polished edges that the rains could not. Bran's ravens watched with their tight, bright eyes as John came through the gates with Ghost. And then he was in the hall where warmth still knew how to speak a man's name. Sansa rose like a winter rose might, improbable and unafraid. Arya leaned against a post with her small, terrible smile. They did not embrace as children. They met each other as survivors who had learned how to count what they had not lost. "Come," Arya said when the hall was quieter, when the talk of bread and patrols and messengers had been stacked into neat piles for the morning. Sansa watched her, then Jon, measuring something, and then she nodded and turned toward matters only a lady could carry. Arya took a candle. Jon took up a second. Ghost took only the dark. In the crypts, their flames made a small procession of stars. Jon felt, as he always did down there, that he was being accompanied by more than those whose footsteps he heard. The old kings regarded them with their steady, sightless stares. He felt his heart lighten, which was the strangest of all sensations. At the oldest vault, Arya pressed her brow to the stone with that small, fierce gravity she reserved for prayers she did not call prayers. Then she touched the secret place, and Jon saw it then. How simple it was, the shape of it like the latch of a gate you assume is a lock until someone shows you the thumb's right turn. The stone slid. The air that came out felt like a question that had waited a very long time. Arya put her hand on the inside surface as if she could feel the story in it. Jon bent, set his candle where the light could lean, and looked. He had been ready to see them again, but readiness is not defense. The 3 eggs lay as after their first night on Earth. The green one had drunk more darkness. The white one held a secret sheen. The red one seemed as heavy as a choice you cannot avoid. He took none of them. He touched all 3 with a knuckle as tender as touching a child's brow to feel for fever. He looked at Arya, and she looked back with a little of the girl who had stood in the yard and thrust a stick like a sword at the winter air. "Father," Jon said, and it was not a question and not an oath but something between them, and Arya's mouth tightened as if to keep from betraying more than she meant to give. "I think so," she replied. "Who else would trust stones over men?" They sealed the eggs and went away, and if that were the end of it, perhaps the world would have had one less story to tell. But the world had chosen a colder tale for that winter, and tales need fire to be told. The first snow-feathered day after, a message came from a village 3 days north, where women had walked into the river without remembering why, and the boy's breath in the morning hung a little longer than it should. Bran sent ravens. Sansa sent men. Jon rode himself. The dead had not come so near since the wall still believed itself permanent. The battle was not heroic. Most are not. It was close and wet and smelled of iron and the kind of fear that men keep inside their teeth and later spit out when they believe themselves alone. Jon's sword was a river of light, and for a while it was enough, until it was almost not, and then a sound rolled across the moor like something too old to have a beginning or an end. It was a sound like ice breaking under the first step of spring. It was a sound like stone remembering fire. The dead faltered. For the brief breath of that strange sound they were men again, unsure, fallible. Jon looked up. The wind wrenched at him with a cold hand. The sky had torn to show a pale, bright seam. He saw nothing but the stark silver of day trying to be born through snow, and then the sound passed. The dead remembered whose breath they used and rallied. After, when the surviving men warmed their hands at fires that seemed too small for their need, Jon stood apart and listened to the memory of that sound. He could not place it. He only knew it belonged to him as surely as the feel of Ghost's fur between his fingers belonged to him, as surely as the shame and pride he had carried since boyhood belonged to him. He returned to Winterfell with his mind full of stone. In the crypts he made no ceremony of it. He lit no extra candle. He did not fetch Arya. He went alone because some choices a man must carry alone, even if only for a moment. He opened the niche. He put both his hands on the red egg. It was heavier than anything had a right to be. He lifted it like lifting a future. He carried it out and set it on the floor and sat with his back against the first king's plinth and looked at it until the lines in it seemed to shift like frost along a window pane when the room is warming. "What do you want from me?" he asked the stillness. The egg did not answer. Ghost lay down, his head on his paws, watching without blinking for a long time. Jon did not expect the stirring. He had told himself that perhaps he would feel better simply to have looked the thing in the eye longer. He had told himself he was not a child listening to songs in a kitchen. And yet when the egg vibrated, a tiny, unmistakable tremor that ran through the stone of the crypt like a secret laugh. He went very still and felt not fear, but the kind of quiet you feel when finally someone says your name correctly for the first time. He did not know how to call dragons. The stories said fire and blood, but he had had enough blood to fill a lifetime. He had had too much fire. It occurred to him all at once that here, beneath the roots of Winterfell, another sort of heat might do. The springs whispered through the stone with an old, steady breath. The eggs had been kept not by sun, but by the earth's own slow heart. Jon lifted the egg again, carried it to the place in the floor where the warmth was strongest, where the flagstones had sweated in summer and winter both. He set the egg there and lay both hands upon it. He closed his eyes and did not pray with words. He did not cut his palm. He thought of a woman he had never known, but who had loved him enough to entrust him to another man's life. He thought of that man choosing a quiet that must have burned like iron. He thought of the wolf that had found him, and the snow that had taught him honesty, and the men he had failed and the men he had saved. He breathed with the spring. The egg warmed. The warmth stayed. Ghost lifted his head and made a soft noise in his throat that Jon had only heard when the wolf first found a mate of his own in a winter so merciless that even wolves had thought to keep one another. The lines on the shell shifted and stayed shifted. He kept vigil until the candle drowned itself. He slept there, his cheek on his crossed arms, and dreamed of a shaft of pale sun striking through branches of black stone. In the dream, he held not a sword but a child that was not a child and weighed no more than a story. In the morning, the egg was warm to the touch. The warmth did not flee when he lifted his hand away. He went and sat with Sansa and Arya and Bran and told them the truth. It was not a council as lords and ladies do it. There were no maesters with twined chains of metals explaining old treatises. No gloved courtiers with smiles they grew like white lilies in the dark. It was only siblings, broken and mended in their several ways, with the weight of a keep upon their joined bones. Bran listened with all of him, ears, eyes, birds, and when Jon had finished the telling, he spoke with the careful pace of a man laying stones. "Father hid them," he said. "He saw something, or he feared something, or the gods gave him a choice. He chose to give the choice to us one day." "What day?" Arya asked, and there was something almost like glee in her voice. Not happy glee, but the sharp joy of having a blade and a purpose for it. "The day Winter asked for a debt," Bran said. "The kind you cannot pay with grain." Sansa looked down at her hands, which were steady. "And if we hatch them, what then? Dragons ask for the world to be a certain shape. We have learned what it costs when a queen decides the cost is a kind of music." Jon looked at her, at the poise she had learned, the iron she had become. He nodded. "If we hatch them, we will teach them the North. They will learn the shape of duty here, not the shape of hunger." "Can dragons be taught so?" Arya asked, grinning a little. "Everything can be taught," Sansa said, "but nothing can be predicted." Bran smiled with only his eyes. "The trees approve," he murmured, and then tilted his head in that bird-like way that said he was hearing a language no one else could. They did not call a feast. They did not light a pyre. Jon brought the red egg to the place where the spring's warmth was surest, and Bran's ravens perched like notes upon the stone beams. And Arya drew her knife along her palm and let a single drop fall not on the shell but on the floor beside it. "For the first promise," she said, and the drop sank at once into the porous stone, as if the keep itself drank it. Sansa laid her cool hand on Jon's shoulder, anchoring him, and another warmth rose in him that had nothing to do with old water. They waited. On the third day, when Jon could smell the earth as if he had been the one to pass beneath it, the red egg cracked. The sound was not loud, but it felt like a sentence coming to its end. A slender line opened along the shell, then another and another, as delicate and inexorable as frost melting on the first good morning of spring. The piece between them lifted, turned into something like a door, and a small, long head thrust through, blind, slick, new. It did not squeal. It breathed, drawing in the air of the crypt like the oldest of the kings might have drawn in breath after holding it beneath the lakes through a winter hunt. It turned toward Jon's warmth. It was the color of old iron and new fire all at once. red with an undercurrent of black that was not shadow but the way a crow's feathers hold all the sky in them. Its eyes were the soft blue of something that had not decided yet what it would be. It made a sound like a kettle beginning to speak. Jon held out his hands without thinking, and the creature put its foreclaws upon his left palm and its weight upon his right and lifted itself, ungainly and perfect. "Hello," Jon said softly, "because that was what you said to a life that had happened where you did not entirely believe it could." Its little jaw opened and closed, and then it shook itself as puppies do. A ridiculous, sacred motion. Ghost leaned close, very careful, and sniffed, and the dragonling sniffed back, then sneezed, which sent a single bead of smoke into the air that vanished at once upon meeting the damp of the crypt. They named it Cinder, but in the older tongue of the Weirwoods, Bran whispered another name over it that Jon did not understand, and Arya forgot as soon as it had been said, as one forgets the taste of snowmelt when one is very young and the world is a flood of sensations. The dragonling ate a sliver of raw lamb and then slept, curled against Jon's wrist as if his pulse were a lullaby. The green egg took longer, the white egg longer still. Sansa spent hours with the red hatchling in the solar, teaching it the difference between her fingers and the meat she brought it, between the hearth and the rug, between a servant's hem and the sky visible through the arrow slit. Bran took it to the Godswood and let it listen to the wind in the red leaves. Arya taught it to leap from one stone to another by motioning and then moving herself, laughing as it learned. Jon slept as one sleeps when a new life snores on one's chest without shame. News rode the roads like wolves. Word of a fire in the sky at the edge of the Wolfswood. Word of the dead pushed back at a village because something had hissed and the snow-rime spears had melted at their tips. Word of the sound again, like ice breaking. The men of the dread fort watched the heavens at night until their necks ached. White Harbor sent fish and a captain's oath that their ships would take dragon or wind alike without flinching. The Manderley bannermen argued about whether it was a good thing, and then decided that perhaps good and bad were luxuries that fit summers better. The green egg cracked one dawn as a fat flake of snow took a long time falling past the slit and the hearth breathed. Where the red was sure, this one was patient. It slid from its shell with dignity and regarded the room with a cool, unafraid gaze, as if it had been judging stone all its life and found it adequate. Arya raised an eyebrow at it. It blinked. "Moss," she suggested, grinning. "Or pine." Bran, who had been listening to a wind that came up from underground, said a word that sounded like the rush of leaves around a stag's shoulders. Sansa smiled and said, "Rowan will do," and the dragon turned its head toward her as if answering a roll call. The white egg was the last and almost had no patience with the business of coming into the world. When it cracked, it did so in a silent snap like the heart of winter on a breathless day when the air is so cold it becomes something to be broken. The creature that shook off its wet veil was pale, yes, but not only white. Its scales held the color of hoarfrost and a serpentine glimmer as if rivers lay beneath them. When Jon touched it, it leaned into him as if his hand were a certainty it had expected. He felt something in his chest unclench that had been clenched since the day he had first understood he was a question that men answered with their discomfort. "Haze," he said, and Bran did not translate the name the trees offered because sometimes names are better when the ones who bear them earn them on their own. 3 dragons, and the world would want to make of them a crown. The world would want to use them as a mouth uses a knife. The world had long practice at that. Jon and his sisters and his brother had less practice at keeping knives safe in their sheaths while still admitting they might be needed. They tried anyway. They did not take them to King's Roads. They did not mount them on the battlements and send letters to far harbors. They carried them to the Godswood and the Crypts, back and forth, teaching them the 2 hearts of Winterfell. The red whispering one above and the warm, old one below. The dragons learned quickly, as all hungry, loved, dangerous things do. They learned the smell of ghost and the taste of trout and how to warm a room without lighting its tapestries. They learned to launch themselves from a standing stone's flat top and how to fold themselves small and coil their tails so that they would not knock over Sansa's ink pots. They learned the difference between the bright, otherworldly light of Jon's blade and the cheaper yellow of a tallow candle, and which one they should resist pressing their tongues to. They learned that Arya would laugh when they stole her glove, and that Bran's stillness meant a river of images they could swim in if they were careful and brave. The dead did not pause their lessons. They pressed. They tasted the air. Their generals in ice cloak and star-splinter bronzed crowns of rime-tapped spear butts that did not splinter upon the earth. They were a theory of winter made flesh. They did not fear dragons because fear is a summer word. They understood only balance and the removal of it. The first time Jon let Cinder fly to meet them, it was not because he wished to make a poem of war. It was because a patrol had gone silent upon a little ridge where the trees stand thin as old men's ribs and the snow drifts like a story reluctant to end. And he could not reach them in time with men. He could with wings. Cinder had grown in a way that made measurements laughable. Its body was still smaller than a warhorse but longer, stronger, more will than weight. It lifted from the courtyard in a single exhale, climbed, opened itself to the cold with a pleasure that made Jon's teeth ache to watch. Riding it is not like riding. It was like deciding to be a different shape for a while. He had been good on a horse all his life. This was not skill. This was something older and simpler and more terrible. The dead on the ridge were moving like sap in a tree in a thaw, slow, inexorable, directionless until all at once it becomes a flood. Cinder hovered, its wings beating with an economy that would one day become ease. And then Jon felt through his thighs and his hands the creature's attentions align. He did not shout. He did not lift his sword. He only opened the place in his chest where warm things were kept for emergencies, and he let the dragon feel what he felt when he warmed his hands at the kitchen hearth with Arya's shoulder bumping his, or when Ghost found his way to the foot of his pallet on a night when he thought he had forgotten how to be alive. Cinder took that and made it a deeper thing and breathed. The fire that came was red gold and contained itself the way a well-taught hound contains its hunger before the whistle. It ran along the snow like dye in water. It cracked the ice around the dead men's ankles and then the dead men's ankles. It drove the thing that called itself a general back 3 paces, which might as well have been 50 miles in such an arithmetic. The smell was not what fire usually smells of. It was sweeter and older, with a strange clear note like the first bite into an apple in a new harvest. He did not win the war that afternoon. He cut a mouthful from it and spit it out. He brought 3 men home on Cinder's back and 2 more dragged on Ghost's harness and 7 wrapped in leather with their faces tied shut. He sat on the floor of the great hall with his back to the wall and his knees up and Cinder's heavy head in his lap and let himself shake the way a man must sometimes. When Sansa came and put a cup in his hand and he lifted it, his fingers made a sound against the metal like small winter branches. "Their ice is older than fire," Bran said later, and his hand stroked Rowan's spine in the slow, long way that a branch might stroke the wind, but not older than stone. Father knew that. He knew which heart to borrow heat from. How did he know? Sansa asked. Bran looked at the far thing only he could see and smiled. He had a friend once who danced where swords fell like rain, he said. He watched a nation end. He held a story that burned like a brand. He chose quiet. Quiet teaches better than fire. They did not keep quiet. Not entirely. Quiet cannot teach a world that refuses to listen. They taught their dragons how to fire in arcs that licked but did not swallow, how to glow along their throats as a warning instead of a promise, how to keep the warmth in their coils on nights when the dead pressed close and the men were losing the argument with their own blood. They sent a man south whose name no one thought to ask, with a note written in Sansa's precise hand, to a queen with hair like iron snow and a fleet whose oars moved like the legs of a black water beetle. They sent a raven west with a message to an island lord whose family had once married a woman who called herself Dragon's Blood, because stories famously find one another when they need to. They sent no word at all to the south where the suns are lazy and the wine is not a sacrament but a sport. That south would hear when it needed to hear. They flew at dusk and returned at night and sometimes did not return at all until morning. And Winterfell learned the shadow of wings the way a face learns a scar. Children reached up their hands to the sky as if to catch pieces of it. Old Nan, who had never died, it turned out, only slept like an idea beneath floorboards, came to the yard and called the dragons by names they would not keep because children never keep the names grandmothers use when those names are too intricate. She shook her head and told them you should never teach a dragon to beg, and Jon promised solemnly to teach them only to ask. He dreamed differently now. The dreams came with rushing water and red leaves trembling and a white shape in the snow that was not ghost and not a deer and not a king but something between. He saw stone men lift stone swords very slowly and then lower them. He saw a woman on a bed of blood who kept saying, "Promise me," not as a plea but as an instruction given to a man she knew would obey. He dreamed of Ned Stark walking alone with a bundle that weighed more than it looked, down steps that had never been counted out loud. He woke with Cinder's claws pricking his shirt through his skin in the nicest possible way, as if to make sure he remembered what world he lived in. The White One, Hayes, grew in sprints, in gasps, as if winter itself were learning to be quick. Hayes liked the gods would best and would sink beneath the black pond until only the ridge of its back and the ripple of its breath betrayed it. When it came out it smelled like old roots and cold blessings, and when it shook itself a spray of water became for an instant a cloud of glittering ice. Bran could not keep from laughing when the dragon did that. The ravens approved, and approval is rare in ravens. When the dead came in a line like a new wall marching, when their spears made little sounds because cold is a music nothing admits, when the wind rapped the tower tops and squeezed as if it were testing a fruit for ripeness, the dragons went up again. Jon did not imagine he was a king. He imagined only that he was a man a certain house had handed a certain tool. He had learned to be good with tools. He remembered every man in the yard who had shown him the shape of a striking arm and the angle of a parry and the thickness of a good winter cloak. He applied those memories to the sky. Cinder breathed and the line broke and became a comma and then a question mark. Rowan curved and let a string of fire drape like a scarf upon a rank of ice-armored survival, and the ice let out a sound like a woman, swallowing a sob, and went to water. Hayes did not breathe as the others did. Hayes breathed in. Jon felt it dragging at the cold, swallowing it, changing the agreement the air had made with winter, where it lifted its head and exhaled. Not fire came but a visible warmth like a slow fog you can only see at dawn when horses stamp and the grass remembers summer. The dead stepped into that fog and were simply confused, and then they faltered long enough for men who were men to remember how to be alive and to drive iron into familiar organs. The old songs had never mentioned that kind of breath, but old songs are earnest and incomplete. The egg that had been wrapped in winter carried winter's other lesson. That warmth is most holy where it should not be. They lost men anyway. They lost friends. They lost names. They lost hours of sleep and pieces of their hearing and the innocence that belonged to a world where dragons were stories and not creatures that put their heads upon your knee inside. Winter does not change itself because you bring it a new instrument, but the shape of it altered slightly, as shorelines alter when a river decides to go another way because a tree has fallen. When at last the general of ice came close enough to be seen clearly from the battlements, a figure picked out in frost and anxiety and something like pity frozen long ago into hardness, Jon went out to meet it. He did not make a speech. He did not lift his sword to be applauded by men with flags. He went with his sisters and his brother and 3 creatures older and newer than the sword he carried. He went to the weirwood first. He put his palm against it, and all at once, he heard the gods not as words but as the sound of a fire in a room where everyone he loved already slept safely. He turned then to the field. It was snow and more snow and a horizon too honest to hide what approached. The thing that led the dead did not hurry. It understood eternity. Jon did not. That was his advantage. He had learned the value of moments because he had once seen a girl's name become a prayer in a man's mouth, and then a promise that turned into every choice a life could hold. The dragons moved to his left and right like ideas that had been convinced to become animals. Ghost went ahead and then back and then ahead again, reading the air. Sansa had her archers placed as if she were embroidering a pattern with men as thread. Arya stood at Jon's shoulder with the small, terrible smile, the one that had no vanity in it, only a calculation that included herself. Bran watched with every eye he had. The Ice General stopped 10 paces from where the godswood roots nearly reached and raised its spear. Jon raised his sword. Their eyes met across the air that smelled like a blade. Jon thought of the first step down into the crypt's long throat and of his father carrying weight with both hands, as if he understood how each future might feel when it touched his skin. He thought of his family arranged around a warmth no other house had noticed beneath their feet, and how no song would ever capture the exact spice and savor of Sansa's bread on the day she baked 3 loaves herself because the kitchen had fallen ill. He thought of the memory of a hand upon his head, cool and heavy, and of a wolf's first quiet greeting. Cinder breathed, Rowan breathed, Hayes breathed in and then exhaled a breath like dawn. When the fires met the ice, the sound was not of war so much as 2 truths acknowledging one another's existence for the first time without contempt. The spear shattered, but so did a piece of Jon's blade near the tip, and he felt the jolt as if he had broken a tooth. The ice general stepped into the fog haze made and paused, as if tasting a thought it had never tasted. Jon took the step that closed the distance. He did not kill a god that day. He did not kill winter. He did not do anything but make use of what had been hidden for him and then trusted to him. The general fell in 3 pieces that turned at once to hoarfrost, and the line of dead behind it wavered in the mindless way of men who have lost a leader they had never seen as a leader but as an axiom. More men lived than died. Fewer boys became men all at once in the worst ways. Winter took a small step back. After the field had been gathered and the soup had been ladled and the prayers for the dead said in all the tongues that remained inside the living, Jon went down to the crypts alone again, not to open any niche but simply to sit on a step with his head in his hands and let the warm breath of the springs talk to his bones. When he lifted his head, he found the oldest king with his stone sword looking down at him with a patient rebuke. "I know," Jon said. "No crowns." He smiled in spite of himself. It felt like a theft from Winter that he was allowed to smile at all. He stood finally and put his palm against the stone where the eggs had been. He felt nothing but the old hummed contentment of rocks left to do their sacred work. He pressed his forehead there, as Arya did, and let himself imagine for one moment that Ned Stark's hand came down and smoothed his hair back as he had once seen it do to Bran when they had thought him asleep and had moved him from a chair to a pallet with care. "Thank you," Jon said, "to stone and ghosts and hot water and the woman who had asked for a promise like a queen asking for justice, and to the man who had obeyed because he had known the shape of a life worth having would always be made of quiet acts." When he climbed back to the hall, Sansa was speaking to men whose arms were too weary to lift and yet who lifted them anyway, and Arya was laughing at something only she found funny because she had earned the right to humor the world as she liked, and Bran was looking at a piece of sky that only ravens knew. The dragons lay in a heap by the hearth, long and lazy, mouths open to the warmth, wings folded like letters from GR. Hateful gods. Ghost slipped between Jon's knees and leaned hard, and Jon nearly fell over and then he laughed again, helpless and privately foolish with it. In the days to come, songs would make what they could of it. Some would say Jon took a crown of shadows and wore it only at night beneath the standing stones. Some would say Arya rode a dragon and her laughter lit up the sky. Some would say Sansa taught a dragon to bow its head to children so that no child in the north would ever fear fire again. Some would say Bran turned into a tree entirely and that the tree whispered to dragons in the old tongue until they learned not to eat sheep unless asked. None of it would be exactly true. All of it would be almost true in the way songs sometimes manage when they don't have the facts but have the desire to be kind. And the oldest king of the Crypts, who had watched men make deals with Winter since the first snow found words, kept his sword across his knees and let his stone wolf nap, and did not move. The earth's warm breath went on. The eggs were gone, but what they had summoned remained like a new verse inside the oldest prayer. Winter would come again, and again after that, and the world would balance its cold suns with a warmth that remembered not crowns or names but the feeling of a hand laid on a sleeping creature's narrow skull, and the way that creature had leaned into it, trusting, and the way a man who had lived an entire life doubting the exact measurements of his place found that trust good and sufficient. Dragonfire stained the sky sometimes at dusk. In certain thaw afternoons, the figures of men and women and wolves and a boy who had become something else entirely moved across the yard with the ease of people who had passed through a story and come out the side where life tastes ordinary again. If you stood in the crypts quietly enough, you could hear the faintest crackle like an ember deciding, even beneath the old stone's patience. It was a sound not of war but of waking. Years after, when the bricks of the keep would have to be replaced in a corner the ravens adored, when children demanded the stories be told plain and then scolded their mothers for telling them too plainly, when men argued with a comfortable heat about whether dragons were more useful than boats or whether the boats would be more useful if they were warmed by dragons, when a certain white wolf grew gaunt with other winters and then lay down and closed his red eye, when a man with gray in his beard that had once grown in a boy's stubbornness stood alone beneath the weirwood with his hand pressed to it and felt the tree greet him like a friend, then sometimes the thought would come, quietly, that none of it had been inevitable. A man had once carried a heavy, impossible kindness into the earth and trusted the earth to remember it. The earth had done so, and in a winter when the world had only narrow doors, that kindness had found a way to fit through. Snow came like a humbling, rounding the edges of Winterfell's newest scars until even the fresh mortar looked old. Men learned all over again the mathematics of cold. How to move fingers without looking down, how to keep a fire small enough to conceal and large enough to matter, how to listen to silence and hear whether it had teeth. Women walked the walls with baskets of bread and onions and gossip that kept men alive in ways no tally ever could. Children learned to name the dragons properly and not by whatever thunder of glory their fathers tried on their tongues at the ale. Names had a weight to them, and the dragons wore them like collars stitched of air. Cinder grew into the command of the sky the way a boy grows into the stride of a father he has finally forgiven. It learned to bank without tearing at the air with impatience. It learned the distance at which its breath cleaved ice and the distance at which it merely argued with it. Rowan learned the particular pleasure of hovering with its wings hardly moving at all while it watched, the way a cat watches, patient with the world's slowness. Hayes learned the old trick of the north. It became what the day needed. Some mornings it was all narrow grace, slicing the air and drawing the cold out of it. Some nights it was a coil of warmth in the gods' wood, its pale belly pressed against earth that had been frozen for hours until the frost surrendered. The ravens approved. Bran's smile was not the kind children paint with their thumbs, not wide and careless. It was a thin, bright thing that happened first in his eyes. When he went into the birds, he did not become them entirely, not anymore. He carried Winterfell with him. He would come back from some long listening with snow caught in his lashes and say, with that restraint that the Starks had left to them after fire and trial, "There is a place 3 miles to the north where the dead keep going in a circle because the wind has tricked them." And Jon would send 3 men and a girl who did not leave a track to see what the wind knew. Sansa's days became a liturgy of minutes. She knew the times a day could break and the times it could simply be folded more tightly. Her hands were the steadiest in Winterfell. She stood in the yard with a book sometimes, but not to read. It steadied the men to see her there, an object of memory unchanged across tasks. The lady who promised the next hour would still find them standing. She took Cinder's skull in her hands when the dragon pushed its head into her lap as if it had always known where she would be. "No stealing cloaks," she told it. "No nipping girls' braids. And no warming the loaves unless cook asks. Bread is bread, but we have ways we prefer it." Cinder blinked slow acquiescence and then stole a boy's glove because rules need practice to take. Arya made friends with a pack of dogs that had been too clever to stay in the kennels and too contrary to be soldiers' hounds. They took to sleeping under Hayes when the wind cut a certain way. A tumble of pelts and pale scale that made old men laugh and shake their heads as if the world owed them some explanation. She stalked along the parapets all bones and fire, and men who had once thought to keep her in needles and courtesies learned what steel and love could do together when they were both taught to be quiet. Jon rode. He rode the sky and he rode the snow, and sometimes he just walked beside Ghost because the rhythm of stepping and the White Wolf's steady presence reminded him that a body is a thing you can live in, not just a machine you drive toward pain. He came to know the shape of the deads pushed the way a farmer knows the shape of weather rolling out of the hills. The enemy did not spread itself evenly. It did not attack as men attack, with flags and insults and a desire to be seen. It pressed where roads met, where water was forced into narrow throats, where old men remembered old wrongs and spoke them loudly enough to be heard at night. It liked to take a place and then leave half of itself standing there invisible, as if to make that place suspect. It loved fear. It was very simple. It made men complicate themselves. He learned to be simpler. He learned to say no the way one says stop to a good horse. He learned to say yes when pride wanted him to say later. He learned not to say I when we would save a life. When the dead pressed a croft with a roof mended by a wife whose hands were cracked and a husband whose back would be a letter of pain for the rest of his days, he said, Rowan. And Rowan dropped from the pale afternoon sky and laid a curtain of flame so fine across the field that the frost broke into steam like a prayer dreamt by the poor. When a patrol did not return because a draw had trapped them and the wind had erased their shout, haze breathed into the ravine until the cold coughed and men could climb. Melisandre came when a long night was almost honest with itself. She walked into Winterfell like a consequence and a benediction, all at once. Her red did not startle the yard. Snow had seen too much blood to be surprised by a color. The heat around her was not the heat of a hearth but the steady fever of an idea a person refuses to let cool. Sansa met her in the yard with neither open hand nor blade. Winter had taught her that there are people who do not belong to either greeting. I have seen fire on snow, Melisandre said. I have seen wolves sleeping under white dragons. I have seen a man with a sword that remembers itself. I have come to see if what I saw is kind. It's not a temple, Arya said, close enough that the woman would know she had been seen 3 times before she had turned her head. If you light anything to make yourself comfortable, you'll ask first. Melisandre turned her gaze to Jon and bowed with an economy that did not waste a movement on sentiment. Azor, don't, Jon said, not unkindly, and the word made a small fog in the air. Don't put anyone's name in your mouths of prophecy. We have enough names to carry. Melisandre looked at the dragons and then at the godswood. And these belong to no god you name, Bran said, and some of the ravens that had been pretending to peck at nothing fluttered all at once and laughed in raven. But they have manners. They listen when the trees hum. You may too. There is more than one song to winter. She did not try to light a pyre under the heart tree. She placed her hand upon her own throat, once, as if to remind her voice whom it served. She stayed. She made herself useful. There were spells she could take out like a needle and stitch around a wound that would have otherwise closed wrong. There were hands she warmed when the house fires had been rationed to embers. There were words she knew for talking to the kind of cold that massed inside a person after a terror and made them believe it had always been there. Sansa watched her, always, with that poised quiet that could become steel in the space between 2 heartbeats. Arya disliked her and did not hide it, and Melisandre seemed oddly comforted by that. Davos came with a smell of salt on his cloak because he had never learned to leave the sea entirely behind him. He looked at the dragons as a man might look at a church that does not offend him but that he does not trust to keep the roof from falling. He bowed clumsily to Sansa because he still believed in bows but had left belief in men behind too many years ago to make the motion elegant. When he and Jon clasped hands, it was as if 2 different versions of the same hard winter decided to approve of one another. I brought ships where I could, Davos said. If you need men taken out of a worse place than the one they're in, I can fetch them. If you need a liar told he's a liar in a way he'll understand, I can do that. If you need a boy told the world will keep if he sleeps, I can do that best. We need all 3, Sansa said, but start with bread. Then lie to the men who think their fear is useful, and tell the boys to sleep after. He grinned at that, surprised and pleased. Aye, my lady, there are worse orders. Rumor worked faster than ravens. Far to the south where stone remembers sun better than snow, a rumor slipped into a queen's cup like a drop of honey. It changed the taste of her wine and the angle of her thought. Daenerys Targaryen had crossed a desert and a sea and the kind of mourning that strips a person of everything and gives them back only what they truly were. She had lost a city and gained a brotherhood and lost a country and found her name in 1,000 mouths, none of which pronounced it as she felt it. She had come to favor the kind of attention that listened for the moral as much as the lyric. When she heard that dragons were flying in the north, she did not rage or laugh or send men to bring her witnesses to be scolded for poetry. She became quiet the way a raven becomes quiet when it has seen a W. Ulf make a decision. They were hatched under stone, Yora said, because the rumor knew the shape of itself even when it had been smudged in the telling. By the Starks, the old magic, the spring under the keep. Stone that breathes, Missandei said, half to herself. Her eyes going to some place maps do not show because they have learned discretion. Dragons of the snow, Grey Worm said with a calm that had never learned to pretend. It should not be possible, Tyrion muttered, but he did not say it like a man trying to talk the world back into a pattern that suits him. He said it like a man revising a sentence he thought final. Possible and impossible are words with a southern bias, Daenerys said and smiled. And in that smile there were no bells, no fires, no little girls holding horses they could not keep. Send a raven if ravens can find us. Send a ship if ships can find a river clean enough to climb through winter. Send a prayer if you can remember how. We will go north and see which story is truer. She did not go with her dragons screaming ahead of her like trumpets. She went with a single ship that had learned to behave in ice and a small company of men and women who had learned to behave in silence. Drogon and Rhaegal and Viserion were too large for a journey that would teach restraint. She left them where heat made sense and brought instead the old kindnesses. Healers whose hands had learned to listen. Cooks who knew how to stretch a thin stew into a reason to live. Women who could teach a house with little wood how to be warmed without smoke. Winterfell smelled the sea before the men upon the walls saw the sails, because certain winds like to tell secrets before they show them. Davos looked down and smiled because something in him had been expecting this since he had been a younger man and not yet learned that honest things cost more than dishonest ones. Jon came to the wall with Ghost a white thought at his side. Sansa stood on the steps below. Arya stood where the sunlight could not catch her blade. When Daenerys came through the gate, Winterfell shifted like a person in sleep who has let go of a bad dream. The dragons lifted their heads from the hearth where the house had made a bargain about embers and ash and did not leap up or howl. They turned with a gravity that recognized the shape of their elder's shadow upon the air, the echo of a song sung in another key. Daenerys looked at Cinder, at Rowan, at Hayes, and then away again so quickly it might have been seen as nothing. Except that the dragons noticed, and the wolves noticed, and the gods would notice, and the man in whom many stories had tried to write their conclusions noticed. She did not say mine, because she had learned that there is no more foolish word in some countries. She said softly, for herself as much as for the yard, "Hello!" The greeting reached further than sound. Cinder flowed toward her and stopped a man's length away because it had learned courtesy in a northern yard. It lowered its head and let the woman smell the heat that made its scales glimmer like a field under noon in a season that had never been. Daenerys reached out and let her palm rest a breath above those scales, not touching until the dragon lifted into her hand the smallest invisible weight that said permission. She touched then, and whatever two histories had been waiting for one another shook hands inside that small circle of warmth. Sansa came down the steps as if she were thinking about bread. She inclined her head with that precise, unfailing courtesy that keeps the world from cutting itself on its own edges. "You are welcome at Winterfell if you take care with our quiet," she said. "There is less of it than there used to be." "I carry more quiet now than once," Daenerys said, and did not lie. The years had given her a voice that could be set down gently upon a table like a pitcher of clear water, and men and women who had dragged thirst behind them for miles would drink until they were ready to speak plainly. They ate together because eating together binds men better than any ceremony men invent for that purpose. Daenerys listened to Sansa talk of grain and fat and the way fear makes men forget to salt the stew. She watched Arya show Cinder how to flick a piece of drifted ash off its nose without looking peevish. She watched Bran watching what only he could. She looked at Jon only in the way one looks at a mountain across a plain while discussing where to plant the next year's barley. Mountains have their own role. They do not need persuasion to stand. When she spoke of her own dragons, she did not adorn herself with them. She spoke their names as one speaks the names of children who have their own beds now, who come down to breakfast without being called. "They are older," she said, "fiercer for it. They forget to be careful and then remember. They have learned to shape their fire. The sky has learned not to be surprised." Jon told her, in that plain speech that does not try to be clever, of the springs, of the egg cracking under the ground, of the way Hayes breathes. "It isn't fire," he said. "Not exactly. It makes the air remember summer without burning." Daenerys's eyes warmed with a thought so beautiful it might have hurt. "Then winter is learning a different word for surrender. It's learning to negotiate," Sansa said, "which is better for everybody." The dead did not invite the new queen to rest. They pressed in a pattern that had not been seen, a bending, a feinting, a learning from the weapons turned against them. The White Walkers came closer, not in a line now but in a stagger, as if they had watched the dragons learn to turn and were trying the same art without understanding hips or breath. That made them more dangerous. Creatures becoming men are worse for a while than creatures or men. Tyrion put his hands behind his back and stood on the wall and watched like a man at a play he has not written but or which he feels responsible anyway. "We'll break them on the field where the frozen river crosses the old road," Davos said, squinting at the map in a way that made it become the view of a man at a mast. "There's rock under the ice that will trip them if they get too proud. There's wind if we need it and shelter if we don't. Rowan will heat the river just enough we can hear it talk," Arya said, and she grinned because she loved to make water tell on itself. "Cinder can rush the left and double back. Hayes keeps the heart," Jon said. "No breath until I say." Daenerys looked to the northeast as if there were a door there that only she could see and which she knew might not open unless asked politely. "Drogon will keep high until the air thins and then decide what he is. Rhaegal loves to mirror the ground. He will use the road as a friend. Viserion." And she stopped for a heartbeat, the kind that can hold a life inside it if one is not careful. "Viserion is the most obedient until he isn't. He should be with Hayes." Sansa's mouth lifted at a corner. "You have a Hayes and I have a boy who was once a prince in a different key," she said to Jon with something like private humor. "Isn't that a thing?" The battle understood it had arrived. The wind arranged itself with the solemnity of a priest. The trees did not speak because they were listening. Men went to the latrine because wisdom is practical. Women checked knots and belts and the tightness of a glove's wrist. The dragons gathered as if they had made a prior arrangement among themselves. Ghost stood with his chest slightly ahead of his paws, that thin line of red in his eye and ember in snow. When they flew without song. Music belonged to hearths. The cold tore at faces and made men's thoughts very clean and very short. The dead came up over the curve of the frozen river like a new alphabet spelled by an unkind child. Their leaders shone like mistakes frozen into glass. Their spears were like sentences that had been polished to a gloss and emptied of meaning. Cinder hit the left flank and then was gone. A slice of fire that did not stay to admire itself. Rowan did not drop as planned. It drifted, learned a new line, wrote it across the sky and the field at once. Haze rose and rose, the pale of it almost indistinguishable from the winter at a distance, then folded itself and came down as a weather the enemy did not know. It did not breathe for a long time. It waited. Drogon circled and did nothing until men forgot he was there, and then he made a single low pass that changed 1,000 choices on the ground into 3. Rhaegal ran with his fire like a hound with a stream, switching sides, catching, letting go. Viserion turned into a streak of discipline, a miracle that makes soldiers laugh with their eyes even during a fight. That particular, grateful contempt men keep for anything that behaves so well one cannot help but hope. He stayed where he was told. He did not reach for too much. He let Hayes set the stage and played his part in a drama with rules. When Hayes breathed, taking cold out of the air until it was a substance you could imagine cupping in your hand and keeping in a chest under the bed until spring, Viserion flicked flame not at bodies but at the ice that had thought to become bodies. The enemy did not feel pain, felt confusion, and confusion made it fragile. A White Walker came within 10 strides of the place where Arya had arranged a circle of men with spears made of 2 woods and tipped in dragonglass, a trick learned from the fact that too many spears had shattered at the wrong moment. It raised its blade and there were thin crackles on the metal where cold was showing off for the wrong audience. Arya took 2 steps into its reach and then 1 step out again, and it adjusted to the rhythm of her as if the world had taught it music just for that exchange. She slid inside and put the knife the world did not see where the thing's thoughts would have been if it had kept any for itself. The sound it made was brief and precise. She looked up and saw Daenerys watch her with a recognition that was not sisterhood and not admiration and not rivalry, but something like the way an animal recognizes another animal that has survived without becoming less beautiful. Jon found the General of Ice not by looking for a crown or a greater flash of frost, but by looking for the place where cold made the ground stubborn. Everything around it tried to become still. He would not. He forced breath in and out so visibly that when Hayes saw him, it could take the measure of his body's argument and copy it. Hayes came low as if to greet a friend at a door and breathed not onto the general but onto the space just around it. The cold did not know what to do with a mercy. Jon went in with his sword that remembered itself and did not try to strike a heroic blow through history's spine. He attached himself to the fight the way a man attaches a hook to a line. With attention, with no show, he broke the wrist. He broke the knee. He broke the thought. When the general fell, it did so without drama. That, perhaps, was the victory. They broke the dead there, and when they ran, they did not run as men run, with terror that can be chased and turned to advantage. They faded, the way bad dreams do when dawn insists. Men cheered anyway because bodies need release, and cheering is better than the weeping that would have come if silence had been kept too long. Jon stood in the wash of noise and felt nothing like triumph. He felt the earth under his boots and the thin, steady thread that ran from his heart to the hot spring in the crypt, to the hand of a dead man who had lowered 3 eggs into stone and chosen to save a world with a quiet gift. After, when the dragons lay on their sides in the long hall, bellies exposed to the hearth, faces ridiculous with sleep, when Ghost snored with his tongue just showing because he had eaten more than was. Wise from the cook's goodwill, when men slept on benches and women on rugs, and none of it mattered because the world was finally, if momentarily, warm, Daenerys and Jon walked in the godswood. They did not talk at first. Trees liked silence, and the weirwood could hear words when men thought their minds were private. "My brother loved a song," Daenerys said finally. "He loved it enough to try to make the world sing it back to him. The world does not sing when told. You coax it. You teach it the tune and hope it likes it." She looked at Jon without bending. "Your father placed eggs in the ground so the earth could decide when to open the door. He taught the world a tune and then shut up. I have not always known how to shut up." Jon's mouth lifted at one corner because the honesty had salt on it and he liked that. "You didn't burn a city this time," he said. It was neither accusation nor absolution. It was a fact set down for both of them to look at. "You brought bread. You brought men who can lift a beam without trying to be seen doing it. You brought someone who knows how to tell a boy to sleep. We needed that." She stepped closer to the heart tree, and the leaves trembled as if a wind had come with her that could not be felt on skin. "And you," she said, as if finishing a sentence already begun, "have 3 dragons who do not look at the world as a thing to be eaten. They look at it as something to be warmed. That is new. They look at it the way the North taught them," Jon said. "Fire that behaves. Heat that listens." They stood there, the ghosts of many men watching gently, and let the tree do what it does best. Hold a room in which truths can be put down without men dying of them. Bran came eventually because he came to all the rooms where truths were set upon tables. He did not walk in noiselessly. Leaves and thin frost crackled under his chair's wheels. He looked at them in the way that means he was also looking at something else and at the past and at a bird's eye and at the line of the wall as it had been and as it might be. "Ned Stark," he said, and his voice was not a boy's anymore, not exactly. He saw a picture that scared him and then a picture that comforted him, and he chose the second not because it was easier but because it was harder. He hid something that would make noise until the right quiet arrived. "You have brought the right quiet." Daenerys bowed her head to the tree. "He was the kind of man I could have used in the South," she said. "Someone to tell me to wait and mean it." "He did that all his life," Jon said. "He waited instead of crowing. He waited instead of demanding thank you. He waited instead of telling his story. He put it in the ground." They did not go south. The South came north as it always has, with panniers of rumor and a cold from its own kind of winter. The kind born of politics and drought and men who love their own reflections. Letters came with seals stamped in metal soft and arrogant. Sansa opened each and read it aloud in a voice that turned fancy into something manageable. "They offer us grain in exchange for pride," she would say, and toss a letter onto a plate. "They offer us marriages in exchange for our dragons behaving like dogs. They offer us pity, which is of no use at all." She wrote back in an ink as dark as a road after rain. "Keep your pity," she penned once to a lord she had never heard of in a country that had grown soft enough to rename its snows. "Send salt and honest wool." Cinder learned to land on the tower the way a careful man sits on a chair that will bear his weight but deserves respect. Rowan made himself thin and shot like an arrow through the space under the gate, where only boys had crawled out to steal apples in the summer. A week later, a boy told his grandchildren that he had seen that, and they believed him, and it made them brave. Hayes learned the unheard-of trick of breathing warmth across a field of sleeping men, so gently that no one woke hot and no one froze. It was like tucking a blanket over the world without touching it. The White Walkers did not vanish. They had been a hypothesis for too long to be unmade in a single proof, but their mathematics failed more often. Their language of cold met a grammar of warmth that did not fight it directly, did not throw adjectives of fire at it and expect it to unravel, but simply made the sentences fall apart before they finished. Fewer boys had their names spoken over a leather-wrapped face. More old men lived long enough to remember the shape of their father's hands. A woman who had thought herself too tired to hold any happiness longer than a minute found herself laughing one afternoon because a dragon sneezed, and it sounded exactly like her youngest cousin used to. The world, rude and gorgeous, made room. One night, when the aurora tore the sky into strips of delicate green silk that had been washed too often and still held the shape of a woman's hands wringing them dry, Jon went into the crypts alone and found he was not alone. A figure moved at the edge of his sight, slower than a man and faster than stone. Ghost lifted his head and huffed once, without alarm. Jon's hand did not go to his sword. He went to the place where the eggs had been, the niche now only a square in the wall the exact color of old breath. The shadow halted where the warm stone gave off its thin comfort. It had the shape of a man who had learned how to stand in a room so that other men would not trip over him. Not in a corner, not in the center, but exactly where he would be useful if needed and invisible if not. Jon did not ask who he was. He knew who he was the way one knows where the hearth is in a dark house one has not visited since childhood. "Father," Jon said, and his voice did not betray him to his own shame by shaking. It was simply a fact laid before the dark. "I have kept your promise." The shadow did not advance and did not flee. It altered just a little the way a sh. Oarline alters when a tide tells it a new story. Jon felt upon his hair a cool that was not as cruel as stone, and not as warm as breath, but a third thing the North kept for moments when men grew old in one instant and needed to keep going anyway. He closed his eyes and nodded without meaning to and opened them again, and the shadow, and perhaps the man, was gone. He told no one for a day. Then he told Arya because Arya believed in ghosts as long as you could put a knife through them if necessary. He told Sansa because Sansa knew grief's manners. He told Bran because Bran had known already and had let Jon have the gift of telling it himself. They went together the next evening and put their hands on the old stone. And Sansa said a thank you she framed not as worship but as a good housekeeper's acknowledgement to someone who had swept the stoop before dawn. Arya breathed in the smell of the springs and smiled with her mouth crooked. Bran said the word that means winter will still come, but we will know where to put the wood this time. Years slid like a river made of days. The South learned to stop being surprised. Its letters grew shorter and its food shipments larger. An old woman in Sunspear taught children to knot cords for hammocks and told them about the time she had dreamed of a white dragon in a pool and woke up warmer. A boy in Old Town wrote a treatise on latent geothermal phenomena and draconian incubation, and found himself pelted with apples by students who had come to love Winterfell from a distance. A Sellsword in the Disputed Lands wrote a song about 3 in the stone, that men sang drunk and women sang sober when they wanted to feel brave. Daenerys did not stay forever. She returned to the lands where she had promised herself she would make things better. Not because she loved them more than the North, but because the North taught her that love is not a currency. "You cannot spend it," Sansa said to her the morning she left, the two of them standing by the open gate while men pretended the wind asked them to look away. "You can only choose whether to hold it while you do the work." "I will hold it," Daenerys said, and she embraced Sansa entirely without calculation, which was the greater miracle. "Be careful with your dragons," Sansa murmured. "Teach them manners every day. Tell yours to remember the smell of bread," Daenerys answered, and laughed softly when Cinder tried to push its head into both their laps at once. Tyrion stayed longer than planned because he discovered he did not stumble much when the ground under his feet felt honest. He played Syvas with Bran and lost without humiliation because losing to a boy who is also a tree is not humiliating. It is like losing to weather. He stood on the wall sometimes with Davos, and they said very little because very little needed saying. "Do you know?" Tyrion said once, startling himself by sounding like a man who could be content. "I had thought the world needed cleverness to be saved, but perhaps it only needs men and women to refuse the simple lies and do the long work." Davos snorted. "Aye, and a dragon's breath that doesn't set the mattresses alight." He added, "Because it is important to give credit where it is due." When spring came, it did not arrive with a trumpet. It arrived in tiny concessions. A thaw that did not refreeze, a bird that sang a note it had been holding all winter, a child throwing off a blanket at night and not shivering. The dragons slept longer in the afternoon sun, stretched so outrageously that the old men in the yard clucked and pretended to scold. Hayes learned the trick of exhaling across the hives so that bees woke without rage. Rowan found a taste for the dust upon Sansa's parchments and had to be swatted away gently lest letters go half-read in the air. Cinder stood sometimes in the middle of the yard and closed its eyes to listen to the sounds of men being ordinary. A cough, a laugh, a complaint about boots, the clatter of a bucket, the measure of a song about a girl with hair like ale who married a miller because millers are steady people. It hummed. It hummed in a way that made even the wary smile. Jon learned how to be still. It was the hardest craft. He planted a little tree beside the God's Blood pond and did not try to make it grow faster by staring. He stood sometimes with a hand upon Hayes' flank and felt the slow, massive breath that was not his and matched it. He said yes to 3 small pledge feasts in ragged villages and no to one lord's attempt to build a hall only to make of it a door for his vanity. He sat with children on the steps, telling them stories about men who did not wear crowns and were therefore not obliged to act like they wore crowns anyway. When he was alone, he would go to the crypts and sit on the steps and talk, not because he believed the dead answered, but because the act of speaking to what had been placed in trust reminded him of the shape of himself. There were more battles. There were worse winters. There were years when the harvest was lean and wolves too close to lambs and water that soured in the barrel no matter how often it was scrubbed. The dragons got old enough to be opinionated and then old enough to say sorry with their bodies when they had been arrogant. The people of the North got old enough to fight about what song should be sung for a queen who had gone away and about whether her dragons had known love. Men who had never seen ice that did not melt except in the mouth of a dragon wrote treatises on the politics of warmth. Crows learned to ignore food left in doorways because children needed to trust that offerings to birds would be accepted sometimes. One summer evening, when the light stretched so thin across the yard that it seemed the day might simply continue into a cleaner version of itself, Arya showed Jon a trick. "Watch," she said, and she put a piece of red string on the stones and stood very still. Cinder bent its head and Dee looked, and Rowan cocked its head the other way, and Hayes' nostrils widened to drink in a scent that was not a scent but a tiny change in the air around string and girl. "They know the difference between a thing and a line," Arya murmured. "They know that a line is only a thing that hasn't become anything else yet." She nudged the string so that it formed a circle. "They like circles," she said, as if confiding a shame. "They think it's a kind of home." Jon laughed and did not hide it. "So do we," he said. "We just forget." He woke some nights still with the old ache, the one that had taught him he was almost and not quite. He would go then where the spring made the lowest stones warm and sit there with his fingers spread upon them. "You gave me enough," he would say into the old dark. You didn't give me fairness, but you gave me enough. He had learned to be grateful to the kind of love that does its work and then disappears. When he grew gray, and he did, slowly, stubbornly, one hair at a time, as if the North were unwilling to admit any change before it had watched it for 10 seasons. He stood by the wall with Bran's chair next to him and Sansa's hand of pressure on his arm and Arya's laughter cutting through a late wind, and watched a child run under Hayes's outstretched wing with a wooden sword held up to prove something no one required him to prove. He felt something like a tide turn inside him. He did not name it out loud. Names make tides shy. Do you think Father would be pleased? Sansa asked, softly, because some questions require the conspiracy of a whisper even when the room is the sky. Jon did not answer at once. He watched the child dart back, shrieking, because Hayes had lowered its wing as if to trap him and then lifted it, extravagant. He watched Ghost rise creakingly from where age had placed him and trot, still beautiful, toward the kitchen, because the kitchen always had something for a creature that had kept a house warm by being in it. He watched Bran turn his head as if listening to a story being told in the next room and smile, one quarter of his mouth, because he knew the end already and liked it anyway. He would be relieved, Jon said, which was more honest. He would be relieved that we did not turn the world into a ball of noise just because we had the tools for it. And the eggs? Arya asked, coming up from nowhere as she loved to do, the edge of a grin tucked into the corner of her mouth because she had made 3 grown people jump without drawing blood. Would he be proud we stole his secret and spent it? We didn't spend it, Sansa said, and the look she gave the yard and the weirwood and the low roofs and the dragons and the men mending a wheel and the woman teaching a boy to wrap a strap correctly had nothing to do with crowns. We invested it. Bran laughed, a singular raven caw embedded in a man's chest. We put it back in the earth, and it grew a story. The air smelled of bread because someone had finally relented and let cinders sit by the ovens, promising not to toast anything unless asked. A farmer whose hands had been cracked once to bleeding by cold lifted his daughter onto a stone so she could see over the yard's bustle and into a future that did not take every choice away from her. 2 old men argued about whether a dragon's breath could ever truly be measured. A woman from the islands west of the Neck taught a girl from the mountain clans a song that helped her keep time while she stitched. And the girl changed the words because songs are better when they fit a mouth exactly. The world kept being so alive that even winter had to pause to admire it. And beneath it all, the warm breath of the springs moved through the stones as it had when no house had stood above. As it had when a man with heavy kindness in his arms had come down with a lamp and a decision. If you lay on the stones with your ear to them and your heart quiet, you could almost hear it. The old, steady hum that the dragons had learned to take into themselves and return as gift. The song that heat makes when it is patient. No braggart blaze, no careless flinging of light, just the work of a heart you do not have to look at to trust. On the very last evening before a winter that would be called gentle in the telling, though it was not gentle for all, Jon went to the crypts again, not as a penitent or a petitioner, just as a man who has grown used to visiting the place where his luck began. He put his palm against the niche and could still feel the faint difference that told him stone had once been opened here. He closed his eyes and for a moment smelled river-wrapped cloth and old leather and iron and that small, unrepeatable smell that newborns have. A smell like a promise that has not yet learned to fear. Thank you, he said. For the last time he would say it in that room. I'll keep it well. No answer came. None was required. Above, in the yard where the 4 seasons had learned to share, Cinder sneezed and Hayes hummed and Rowan scratched delicately under a wing as if adjusting a thought. Ghost, old and tender, laid his head on the instep of a man who had finally grown comfortable inside his own story. The first stars came out with the absent-minded exactness of a good steward laying knives in their old, familiar places. And Winterfell, which had listened to oaths and executions and births and quiet betrayals, listened now to laughter and bread and the whisper of dragons' lungs, and remembered all of it the way stone remembers what it is for.